Oh, all right.
Hello, everyone that we can't see.
Hi.
Hi. It's nice to meet you here in cyberspace. My name's Jenn Mayer.
I am Anna Hartley.
So excited to have you join us today. Welcome for our very first office hours. My first time doing anything like this. Is it yours?
Me too. First time talking into the void of cyberspace. Hoping people are listening, and nice to meet you. Sorry we can't have an interaction, but yeah, first time.
Cool. Well, it's kind of amazing where we actually are today. If you take a look behind us, this fantastic sign that says magic. We are here making magic in IDEO San Francisco's shop, which is an incredible place where things are made and prototyped all the time. It's one of the big advantages of working here is that you can actually, if you have an idea, come in, use a whole bunch of the materials that are around here, hack it together, see what works. And you just have this incredible sort of play, make space that you can make your ideas real. So we're very fortunate in that regard.
Yeah. You can't see everything, but we have 3D printers, we have bandsaws, we have a giant cutting board. There are projects everywhere that are kind of in partially prototyped at this point. And as a writer, I have to say I don't use the shop to build stuff a lot, but it's one of my favorite places to hide and write because it's very quiet. Or at least it's like your project team isn't around, so you can get your focus in.
Yeah.
So it's one of my secret spots.
Yeah, I've actually had people help me use the shop to create, like to put stories on big boards, or to figure out different ways to show parts of the story or show images, making posters, things like that. So you never know where you might wind up with that. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen in the next 45 minutes. We're going to be taking your questions, which is awesome, and attempting to answer them. So be kind. We might not know all the answers, but we'll sure give it our best shot. So what we'd love for you to do is, with each question, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and that's about it. But we want to show you how you can actually ask questions, because that's rather important.
Cool. So first, on the top of your screen, you'll need to click up here. A little bunch of icons will come down, and then from there you want to find the Q&A icon. Click on that, and then into that window you can type the content that Jenn just said, your name, where you're from, and your question. Or you can tweet questions at us at IDEO U, and we'll be collecting those questions and answering them for you live.
And if we don't get questions, we will just sit here and tell jokes. So we have a question already that we can answer here. And that question is, I'll read it aloud first. My main challenge has been identifying my audience. How do you go about finding the right balance between overgeneralizing and being too specific in identifying your audience? Excellent question. Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot in the course about the importance of figuring out specifically who you're talking to and getting a little bit of about detail about that, you know, so it's not just executives. It might be something like executives from this location who are grappling with this particular issue. But yeah, I suppose you could get too specific, like, although now that I say that,
I love the specificity, so.
Yeah, it's sort of like the more you know.
I would say it also depends on like identifying the outcome that you want to have, because if your outcome was to convince, you know, the CEO to change his or her mind, that is an audience of one that could have a huge impact. Or if your goal is to kind of speak to the entire city of San Francisco, then you have a really different brief. And I think that how specific you need to get with that audience is really tied to the outcome that you're inspiring with your story. So that would be a question I would kind of ask first off. But another way to test, I think, how broadly relevant your story is to prototype with either positioning statements, or you could prototype by making a really scrappy video or a kind of low fidelity version of whatever your deliverable is, and showing it to different potential audience members and seeing where it's resonant and if you're accessing the right audience for that outcome. And from there, you can kind of maybe edit out the audience that doesn't seem as relevant for that message or that outcome.
That is a fantastic answer. I agree wholeheartedly. Do what she says. So next up, we want to welcome Eliza from Toronto, Canada. Shout out to Canada.
Oh, and George from Georgia.
That's awesome too.
Very poetic. Got more coming. Okay, another question. This one. My main challenge has been my blueprint. I have a tendency to diverge, expand my scope, and my message. What tips do you have to help me let go of some of them?
Boy, whenever it's so hard to, I guess you call it like kill your darlings. Like you have a whole bunch of ideas and you think like, I want to include them all because they're all so important to the story. They're all so valid. And at some point you just have to be vicious. And you just have to realize that the more you try and cram in, the less you will actually be able to say. So, you know, I wonder if one technique for doing that might be to force yourself to rank and put things in order and say, okay, you know, I'm not going to kill anything yet, but let's take a look at what's the most important thing and the second most important thing. And you can't cheat and put everything on the same level. You've got to rank it and then start, you know, peeling away the stuff that's at the bottom to figure out what am I really going to focus on here? Because again, that sort of singular focus is going to allow you to make your most effective story and your most effective point.
Yeah, I would agree with what she said. And in addition to that, you know, even if you have those layers that you have to peel away and not address, the very act of going through the process of kind of identifying that and then deciding that it's not as important is naturally going to help you understand everything outside of your story that you're not necessarily saying in the piece, but that you need to know just in order to be able to effectively articulate.
Yeah.
It's kind of the way that you hear novelists, you know, writing the backstory of different characters and like just knowing what's going on and then being like, you know what, you as the audience don't need to know that. I know it. And
that's so
here's
true.
the meat of it. So,
you know, one of the things that I sometimes do when I write is to let myself have it all out, like get it all out there, because for something in my process, I need to do that. But then I challenge myself to say, okay, I'm going to cut this in half and just see if I can do it, and wind up just cutting away, getting down to that point that I've agreed to with myself, and then rereading it and seeing, does it still make sense? And I would say 8 times out of 10, it still holds just as much value as it did in the really long version. And I've just cut out the extraneous stuff. And, you know, because I love to hear myself talk. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be there.
Yeah. Okay, so for people who have just joined us, we're going to do a little quick rehash, and for everyone else that's still with us, bear with us. So we are joining you from San Francisco. I'm Anna Hartley.
And I'm Jenn Mayer.
Hello. And we're here in the IDEO shop, which is a really cool place to do a bunch of prototyping. And we're answering some questions. And so there's a couple ways that you can ask us questions live, and we'll be taking them and answering them to the best of our abilities. So should I do this one again?
Do it again. You're so good at it.
Before, little Vanna White. Okay, so you want to find this little click down menu in your screen. A bunch of icons will show up, and one of those icons will be a
Q&A.
So click that, baby. Type your name, where you're from, ask us your questions. We are so excited to have this interaction with you, so we hope you've got some good ones. And we also have a Twitter option. Ooh, where you can do a little @IDEOU and ask us your questions that way.
And you can hashtag anything you put on Twitter with hashtag storytelling for influence.
All right.
Oh, we got a question here from George in Georgia.
George in Georgia is our
Thank you,
favorite.
George.
He's got the poetic,
I know,
like symmetry here.
Question is, I need to make my people care about what they do, but it is hard. Where do you begin? When have you experienced this? Wow, yeah, I mean, that is important. Like, everyone needs to care about what they do and find some value in it. I mean, it's a little bit hard to answer in generalities, not knowing exactly what it is that your challenge is specifically, but I always find when I need to get someone to care about something, it's about finding some sort of common ground that you can tap into an emotional core. You know, if you really dig into it, there's value in almost anything that we do, like no matter how menial or how seemingly, you know, inconsequential. If you think about how everything is related in a greater chain of being. So if you find that amazing commonality or that thing that links the thing that you're doing to a bigger story, something that's like more meaningful, I'd imagine that that would be one way in to get people to care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also, you know, kind of in a more general way, there's this notion of finding a hero story and making it maybe a little less about like, you should do this, and more, here's an example of someone who's already behaving in the way that I am hoping that you can behave, or like has this value of really being inspired that I hope that you can have. So often storytelling can be a way of getting that end goal across in a way that we help the viewer kind of come to their own conclusion. So it might be your own story and why you care about it. It might be finding some really inspiring person to profile, or, you know, heroizing the behavior that you're hoping to inspire might actually create that outcome without needing to tell someone what they should do.
Nice. We have another question here from Eliza or Eliza in Toronto. I apologize in advance for potentially butchering your name. And part of the question I can't see here. There we go. We've had a hard time including the benefits to the user without actually listing them. What techniques can you share to include benefits more naturally in the story? So I'm just taking a moment to kind of parse the question and think about how to answer that and see if I understand it correctly. Hard time including the benefits to the user without actually listing them. What techniques can you share to include benefits more naturally in the story?
Let's see. I'm thinking of if this is about a product, that's kind of one way that this question might be posed. So maybe I'll answer it that way. If this is a product and you're thinking about, you know, how can you express the benefits without listing them out in a kind of more didactic way? And a lot of times we think about what's the kind of emotional hook or the inspiration for the outcome in that situation. So it might be a calendar technology. And instead of saying like, this can help you, you know, do feature A, feature B, and feature C, it's like showing the pain point and then showing the relief from that pain point. So like, I forget all my appointments and I don't know what's going on and my life feels frenetic. It's more kind of like showing that story of the chaos followed by the benefits. So it's a lot of like a situational story rather than a list of features.
I think I've also done a lot of like day in the life kinds of stories where you imagine a future where this thing already exists and you are telling that story as if that thing was just completely already in use, and you naturally see the benefits through the situation without saying like, bling, makes teeth whiter. It's like you're actually sort of describing the benefit in context.
Yeah. Okay, we've got one from Julia in NYC. Julia says, I was never totally satisfied with my brief, and it has vexed me in my next steps. Any tips on honing in on the story you want to tell?
Yeah, a brief is so foundational, right? Like it's like if you don't have that blueprint and then you go to build a house and the house looks wonky, you're like, well, it's probably that blueprint. I mean, I guess the first thing I would ask is it too late to go back and tighten that brief versus trying to fix the story after the fact? And I would definitely use that, again, the prototyping and feedback sessions and iterative loops to go back and get the right brief. So if you have a sense like this brief just isn't quite working, who can you put it in front of to get their input to then try and iterate and make it a little bit better and a little bit sharper? And then also maybe since you've taken a crack at telling your story with kind of the brief that wasn't perfect, if you could take a look and say, what part of the story isn't working, right? Like it just doesn't, this isn't connecting or that isn't working, and what part of the brief is leading to that lack of traction, then you might be able to say like, okay, it's just this part of the brief I need to tighten, and I don't need to scrap the whole kit and caboodle to get something wonderful.
Yeah, that feels, it's like try to shine the light on that area that's like your intuition is telling you something, that there might be a like cognitive disconnect somewhere. So whether that's through prototyping or going through your story and just being really mindful of like, where is that stickiness coming from? And, you know, maybe even circle a few of those areas if you're not sure, and just try it out. Like if I were to say this was a different audience, like who else would the audience be? But
the awesome thing in this scenario is that you had that instinct. Like pat on the back for that, because like you were able to take a look at this, feel that something was amiss, and now you can address it. And, you know, not everybody has that kind of facility. So, you know, give yourself props for doing that and noticing it. Okay, we have another question from Mikkel in Denmark. Can you say something about your thoughts on the ideal length for a video? The classic ideal length for a video question that we grapple with all the time.
Yeah, good question.
I think, I didn't mean to step on your toes, so I was about to jump in.
Jump in.
All right,
jump
well,
in
let's go jump. All right, jump, everybody jump, everybody jump. I think that the first thing you have to figure out is, where is this going to be? So the ideal length for a video that's going to be posted on YouTube for something might be very different than the ideal length for a video that you're going to be using in a presentation in a boardroom. And then at the same time, within both of those contexts, or whatever context, you know, what are you trying to make people feel, and what will the appropriate length be for that? Like, there are times when you need to dig in and need to give yourself a little bit longer. But for the most part, people's attention spans are pretty short. And unless you are, you know, having production values of like, you know, Steven Spielberg proportions, like you want to keep something as short as you can possibly make it and still get your point across.
Yeah, when you jumped in, I was going to say something similar about medium, and also everything around like how much distraction will there be if someone's watching it on their phone. It's like a lot less focused than if they're in some sort of like theater setting or immersive environment. So that's definitely the first thing. And I think for if just like a hardline answer in terms of if it's like an overview video of something that you're trying to talk about the strategy, I usually try to keep it like 2 minutes max.
Yeah.
Because I do think you get a lot of drop off beyond that. And it's, you know, you kind of want to be really strategic also about where are you packing the punches, like setting it up in a way that people kind of are intrigued and excited to go past that first 30 seconds and have a glimmer of what that next aha will be. Because video, while incredibly effective, also has, you know, someone can always turn it off and then you're like, but the end, that's where everything was.
And there's nothing worse to getting that point in the video where the crowd is just like, make it stop, you know? So like, I think 2 minutes is a really good rule of thumb, sweet spot. And then if you're going over 3 minutes, I think for almost anything, you're in trouble land.
Oh, trouble land.
Trouble land.
The place we try to avoid. But not trouble land. In Asheville, we have Pete and Jess in Melbourne, as I hear the Aussies say. So that question was, how do you get buy-in from people you're working with to prototype your story? It's been difficult to get people excited to look at something less polished. Okay.
That's a good question. Well, I mean, the way that you phrase it, it's been difficult to get people excited to look at something less polished, question mark. I'm wondering if you're, on our end, that has not been, I've not experienced that, but I think that that's because one way that you can bring people into it is in letting them know just how valuable their thoughts are at this point in the process and being really transparent about where you're at in the process. So like, I imagine walking up to someone and saying like, I've got a draft of something that is incredibly rough and I want to put all my cards on the table and tell you like, this is totally unfinished, but this is such an awesome opportunity. I'm really looking forward to getting your input to help make this so much better and take it to the next level. Are you willing to do that with me? And I think most people are really excited to be able to give their input and excited to see things before it's gone too far and before it's really, really done.
And I think if that's definitely true of users and having kind of entering it with that sense of humility, like if that's your user, they're going to have an opinion that is actually quite relevant and would create huge insights for you to be able to kind of focus that story in a more relevant way. And if you're trying to convince someone that you're working with that's maybe more of like a boss or a client, that prototyping is really valuable, the thing that's great about it is that it is really cheap. You know, it could be like a piece of paper, and if you're talking about like prototyping something on a piece of paper versus doing a full production on a video, like it takes an hour and, you know, no money versus like months and a lot of money. I think that kind of like comparison is really
It's a
valuable.
Cost-benefit analysis.
Cost-benefit analysis. And I'm like, what's that? Yes. And you can do a lot of loops of it. And so it's kind of like we often, with our clients, will set up prototyping that way because it, for us, is so valuable. For them, it's also very valuable because instead of doing full tilt production on something that no one's certain about, we can have a really good sense that, like, yes, this is resonant. We've talked to the audience, we've co-created with them, and we feel really confident that now this is the thing that we should do full production on.
Yep. Next up, we have Alejandra in Mexico. What are your tips on narrowing the story? How do I focus? I have a lot of info and inspiration, and now I feel lost more than ever. Help. Yikes. Yep. That is a hard place to be.
Okay, so you've got a lot of info and inspiration, which is good, but when you haven't yet kind of organized it, that can be really overwhelming. I think that one tip for narrowing the story is creating an outline, and outlines just really help me kind of organize my thoughts in terms of, like, if I have all this inspiration and information, like, where is it living and how am I kind of bucketing it so that I can even see the areas of content that I'm working with. And then from there, it's kind of going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is like prioritizing and deciding what does the recipient of this story really need to know versus what do I, as the designer, need to know, that just kind of creates all of the background that supports the story that I'm going to tell.
I think another approach that you could take, because I completely agree with what Anna is saying, is to, as you kind of make that outline, if you were to take all of the input that you have and all the inspiration and start to bucket it and see that you might have 5 stories out of the content that you have, and bucket everything into which story category it might go in, and then allow yourself to put 4 of those stories aside. Those might be future stories that you tell. So you don't have to get rid of them completely. They could just be stories for later. And then it allows you to focus on just that one narrow bucket, really nail that, and then move on to another story later.
Okay, Julia. We don't know where she's from. How mysterious. Julia asks, any tips on becoming a more mindful listener or reader of other stories? How might we learn from the craft of the story versus just consume it?
I love that question.
Yeah,
that's
awesome.
Amazing. That's such a good, I actually I think about this a lot, but I don't act on it enough almost, because I tend to consume stories like potato chips. Like I'm just so excited by stories and storytelling. And I sometimes want to force myself to slow down and pay better attention to what I'm hearing. I think sometimes when I really, really want to take in information, I take handwritten notes. I find for me personally that typing is distracting, but there's something about writing just a few words here and there by hand that allows me to take in the information in a very different way. I also find, again, this is a whole bunch of me search, like I find that I have a hard time taking in written stories on screen. So I print things when I really want to absorb them in a different way. I highlight things, I underline, and there's actually science behind that as well. The act of underlining. It's not that you'll actually probably go back and look at it later. It's a reinforcement in your brain of seeing it one more time underlined that helps you retain information.
Cool. I also love this question. So I just like to nerd out about writing all the time. So right now I'm reading this book called On Writing by Stephen King, which is funny because I don't really read a lot of Stephen King novels, but he breaks down a lot of the approaches that he takes to fiction writing and writing in general. And it's interesting because he kind of writes like what some people could say is like pop fiction, but he's like, hey, we're all craftspeople here. Like, let's not say that like I'm not. And when the chapter I was reading this morning, he basically says like, you have to do 2 things to be a writer. You have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. And he's just like, just read a ton of books. And so that this question is like, when do you really want to, sometimes I like to just get lost in a book or in a story or in a movie or whatever it is. And then other times I really, especially often if I find myself kind of transported by it, it's interesting to go back and try to almost like figure out how it was crafted. So it's like, wow, that like I've done this with books that I've read, it's like, oh, well, if I were to actually outline the steps that this story takes, like what does that look like? You almost can retrofit the process to it once you've consumed it as like the reader or the viewer. So that's something I think I also naturally do in the back of my head a lot, and sometimes I do it more in a more focused manner. But I would say maybe like pick a few of those stories that you find really inspiring and do this exercise of trying to break it down and understand like what was under the hood there, because a ton of craftsmanship goes into anything that is like, you know, that you can get lost in.
And I would say discussion as well, like talking it out with other folks who have read or viewed the story as well, to find out what are they picking up on and what you might want to take on from their thoughts, or what you might want to dispute, and just kind of wrestling it out. Like I find that incredibly helpful and validating, and like it brings up so much more to me, that things that I've just never noticed.
Cool. Okay, so Donna in South Carolina has asked, giving feedback is so much harder than I expected. As a story editor reviewer, where do you even begin?
Yeah, giving feedback is hard. Taking feedback is hard. Oh, yeah. You know, we live in a culture, I think, where we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, you know, but I think feedback should always be given in service of the person that you're giving the feedback to. So if you're giving feedback just to tear something down, or someone is giving you feedback with the intention of tearing it down, like that's not really feedback. That's just sort of being a jerk, at least in my opinion. And I think though, once you start to take feedback as something that is here to make something better, you can take it in or give it in a really open-hearted and generous way. And that spirit of generosity, I think, is the difference between scary feedback and really great feedback.
Yeah, I feel like there's two elements to good feedback. One is like, when are you getting it or giving it? And the second is, what's the focus of it, or like the parameters that you place around it? So sometimes I think bad feedback experiences happen when, say I wrote something and Jen's like, hey, like, I want to, like, let me read it. I want to give you feedback. And I'm like, it's like half baked and I haven't really figured out, like, I don't even know yet what it's about. And like, I'm not ready, but she reads it, then I'm going to be way more sensitive, because it's kind of like, well, it's not even the version of the story that I thought it was going to be. And now you gave me this feedback. But the second thing is, you know, say I do have that completed version of whatever it is. And Jen's like, hey, I want to give you feedback. And I'm like, awesome, Jenn, like give me some feedback on tone of voice, or on the medium, or on, you know, whatever those elements are of it. And I think it's the responsibility of both the reviewer and the person who's created the story to sort of have an honest discussion beforehand of like, what are the focal areas of this feedback session? Because then everyone's kind of prepared for it, and you're able to hash it out beforehand, where maybe the medium is like set in stone. And if Jen's like, it can't be a video, then I'm like, well, I'm screwed now. Like, you know? But I also think it's like being a little bit open about having small bouts of discussions in that manner, like along the way, so that you're also not getting feedback at the 11th hour when nothing is changeable. And then it's like, you might produce something that you feel like you're not proud of because you got late stage feedback.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, what you're saying is like, if you tell the person who's giving you feedback and give them some parameters, it takes an incredible amount of pressure off, right? Because then instead of being like, wow, I could comment on everything and anything, it's like, you know, these are the things that are going to be helpful to me. And then I can focus on that and look for it, as opposed to trying to boil the ocean of like what I might possibly talk about. Super helpful. So just real quickly, for anybody who might have just joined, we want to remind how you can send in a question. Top of your screen, you're going to see a little something that looks like this. Up in the corner, there's a grid of boxes where you will find one of these, a little place for Q&A, and you can input your question and who you are and where you're from in there. You can also tweet at us at IDEO U with your question, and we'd be happy to take it from the Twitterverse.
The Twitterverse.
Yeah, the Twitterverse. And you can also feel free to hashtag it with hashtag storytelling for influence.
Okay. So Eliza in Toronto has asked us, have you ever had to tell a story that you couldn't relate to? How did you ever get over this? Or how did you get over this? I added the ever. I think that if I've done the appropriate amount of empathy building and research, and I really believe in the story, it should be relatable on a kind of human level. So I'm trying to think of a time that I've told a story that I couldn't relate to. I think there have been situations where it's a context or an audience that like is not me per se, but I can relate to the notion of, caring about your health or aspiring to have a family, or like it's almost like, what is the essential human part of the story that while it might not be me, I can understand it, and kind of writing from that place helps me write in voices and to audiences that are not me directly, but I think still in an authentic way.
I think that's true. I think that human piece and that empathy piece are crucial in making stories that matter and stories that you believe in. Because I can think of times when I've had to tell stories that I felt much less attached to and much less proud of when I was working in another industry. And it was sort of before I had come to understand the importance of that human connection and of being real with the people that I was working with. And I would feel like I was selling stuff. And when you're in a position of just trying to sell stuff, and there's sort of like an us-them attitude of like, I'm going to sort of put one over on you, it's really hard to tell an authentic, beautiful story. When you can switch it from that place of selling to a place of like empathy and relationship building, then I think you get to a much better place with your story and with what you can achieve, even if it is about selling. Not because the selling part's not bad, right? I don't mean to make it sound like that. Yeah. So next we have Eli from Stanford, and Eli asks, how do you know when you have faith in your storytelling abilities and when to take advice from others? When do you stop prototyping?
You stop prototyping when it's got to go out.
I feel like it's like
you're just like, final touch is okay, fine, it's fine. I think this is like, in the project spaces, that's always, for every craft, storytelling included, there's this like, I could continue to iterate this thing forever. And so I think as you become more experienced, you're able to like kind of identify that, like the phases of iteration when you get closer to the end versus like pulling all-nighters every single night and never feeling like you're finished. I don't know if you had
I feel
went
like
down a tangent there. But
part of it is about just experience and having done it multiple times, but I feel like you sort of get to a point of diminishing returns where you've gone through a couple of iterations, and then the feedback that you're starting to get starts to just feel less and less useful or relevant, or it's kind of like, well, I thought about that, but I've made this deliberate decision because of X, Y, and Z. And at that point, you really do have to just trust yourself. And that whole process might be trial and error too, because you could say, this is done, then present a story, and it flops, and you're like, maybe it wasn't done. So you can learn next time that you might need to go a couple rounds further.
I feel like
I see a framework coming on.
It's a framework, guys. On a Post-it, no less. So I think, kind of what Jen's describing feels to me like this loop where at the beginning, your iterations are like big shifts or realizations where you're like, oh my God, like I didn't even see that thing. And now that I've prototyped it, I understand, and I'm going to change it. I'm going to go there and then here and here and here. And each of these loops actually is some sort of like a moment that you might take advice from others, whether that's like sitting with your team or doing some prototyping, and kind of having that humble attitude of really seeking feedback at those points. And then I think when you get closer to these small loops, for me, that's like, I want to be a little more heads down and doing the craft part of it. And then I might ask another kind of expert in storytelling for advice. And then it's kind of like getting closer to the fine tuning and placing the stakes in the ground that you're like, yeah, I'm actually not back here where I need the big shift things because I've already explored that territory. Now I want a copy edit from someone who I like trust, or like a filmmaker's point of view,
Right.
or whatever.
And this gets back to your earlier point about asking for the kind of feedback that you need, because if you're somewhere down here and someone wants to give you this kind of feedback, you're like, well, it's not the time for, you know, structure changing feedback. It's the time for like minor copy edits or whatever.
Yes, we got a framework in. I knew it was
All
going to
right, nicely done. We got Pete in Asheville, North Carolina. Hi, Pete. I was recently in Asheville. Lovely city.
Pete, so he asks, I own a socially responsible investment firm. I love the who is your audience exercise, except I generated a painfully long list. How do I even begin to prioritize?
Well, I guess the question is that painfully long list for one particular story? Or is it for kind of like everyone that you want to talk to ever for every story? Because, you know, a target audience might be pretty broad, but you can get really specific for like one story that you want to tell.
Yeah, that's a great point. So even just like the context of your question. So if it's an investment firm, you might say like, well, actually I want to inspire young users and like older, more financially stable people, but like they're all my audience. And to Jenn's point, it's like, well, the perspective that someone might have on your value proposition is actually going to be quite different depending on either age or demographic. So a way to even, even if you're like, I don't know what story I want to tell yet, you might say, well, for each of these audiences, here's the core value that I bring. And it might be different depending on what you know or what you could learn about that audience by doing some research.
I mean, the other way to think about it is as behavioral segments, which is something we don't necessarily talk about in this course, but I believe might be covered in some of the other IDEO U courses, where the idea is, you know, you're not looking at demographics per se. You're not saying like, I want to talk to young people who make X amount of money. You're looking at the way that people behave. And so people of all ages, from all parts of the country, from, you know, with all different backgrounds, might have certain things in common. Like, so you might be, for example, I'm interested in telling this story to people who are, I'm making all this up, extremely tech savvy users who want to do their own investing or something like that. And that person might be 22 and they might be 52, but they share that behavior. So if you slice and dice it by what are the behaviors you're looking for, you might be able to narrow down on an audience more than types of people.
Yeah, it's a great build. Okay, Jess from Australia again. She asks, do you have any rituals, habits, or activities that help you switch the tone of your writing when you're stuck? That's a good one.
Yeah. Do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts. So I think that rituals and habits, I actually really like to change the place that I'm sitting when I'm writing. People are always like, I see you all over the place. And it's because like sometimes just physically moving space or even getting out of the office or getting into a context that feels closer to that audience or the kind of feeling that I want to evoke can really help with that. If I can't do that, I also will often try to find bits of inspiration that have some of the essence that I'm hoping to evoke, whether that's like a video or a piece of writing or even a song, like a sound, like things like that can really help me listen or watch and then access this kind of ear feeling of like, oh, I want to create something that sounds more like that. And if you're exploring different tones, you can actually do that with like a different type of content that you're like kind of consuming and then experimenting with. And even something like doing some exercises where you have a story and maybe writing it in the third person where you're just talking kind of from far away, in the first person where like it's an I voice and you're in the middle of the action, or even the second person, like being more like you, blah, 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 blah. Sometimes I'll actually write all three of them more as a way to explore and then see which one feels like it's kind of resonating and exciting and maybe fresh in a way that other videos or stories might not be.
I have all sorts of weird rituals and habits. Like it's really strange. When I know I need to sit down and write, I have to, this is maybe too much information. I always have to go to the bathroom first, get it out, Like I've got it, like clear mind. Then I go and I get myself a cup of tea. And I have to sit down with a tea. I get on my headphones. I listen to soothing ocean sounds, which you can find like online on YouTube for like 8 hour length, or I have a CD of it as well. That I later CD of it. That's how long I had it for. Like I ripped it to an MP3. Yeah, it's like a reel to reel. And then I kind of like get into my little hovel. I can't have any distraction. But like you, Anna, I will look for inspiration by diving into the voices that I like. So recently I had to write some stuff that was, I wanted it to be sort of scientific, but human and funny. And I just read a ton of Mary Roach, who is an amazing author who writes these incredibly compelling nonfiction books about science that read like novels. And she comes across as simultaneously the funniest person you'd meet at a cocktail party, but brilliant like science mind. And it's that amazing overlap that I wanted to recreate. And then you just sort of start to mimic. And there's nothing wrong with mimicking. Like you find a tone that you like, try and write in that tone and see how you can sort of put your own special spin on it. Yeah. Got 2 last questions. It goes so fast.
I know. It's just like, psh.
All right. We've got Carolyn in Toronto. It is very cold, I'm assuming. I hope you're surviving the winter. It's actually cold here in San Francisco too, which it rarely is. So
California cold.
Yeah. Well, yeah. we're just trying to empathize. Yeah. So my organization serves youth in the justice system. How can we tell stories to show our impact and build empathy while protecting the privacy of our youth? Yeah, that is something we grapple with all the time at IDEO, because we have all kinds of things that we live in healthcare or working with children that we have to do that for.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, the fact that you're even asking this question is a great, it's like a constraint of your brief. And there are often times with stories that that's the case where it's, you know, we cannot show someone's face. So we know that off the bat, which is good because as you go into your storytelling planning, you can account for that. There's nothing worse than making that mistake and kind of gathering the assets or doing the research for your story and then realizing like it's unusable because it's all video and whatever it may be. I think a lot of times what we've done is to protect privacy is abstracting images. So that could be like a more illustrative way of showing something with someone's voice or with someone's quote that's anonymized so that, you know, it's still representing the experiences of someone, but we're not showing their face and we're making sure that all of those, the kind of like boundaries to protect them are set up. That's what's immediately coming to mind.
I think
audio can be really powerful.
I was just say audio. I once did an audio montage, and it was for a health-related client. So we had some constraints about what we were going to be able to share, but we used the voices of several participants that we just cut together in audio clips with just some really beautiful, evocative imagery that wasn't of them, and just played the audio with it. And that theater of the mind was actually quite powerful because it allowed people to sort of imagine those folks, hear the texture of their voice, hear the sounds in the background. I mean, it's kind of like when you listen to, you know, to a great radio or a great podcast, you actually feel there's an incredible intimacy there just using the audio. But yeah, using quotes, making illustrations, everything that Anna said, absolutely.
Okay. I think this might be our last question. This one is from Vizak on Twitter. And this question is, I'm curious to hear about your own personal journeys as storytellers. Did you always use these processes? How did you get here? Also a classic question.
Yeah.
The answer is lots of twists and turns, but an intuitive sense that I always wanted to be a storyteller, I think, for me. I mean, yeah, my story was I just have always noodled with words. Like, I think even as a kid, when I was like a child, I was like, I'm going to be a writer. And it's interesting that I think with all of our creative mediums, like there is that kind of sense of what clicks with you and what inspires you. And for me, I took a really exploratory mindset towards it early on, where I did every type of writing that I could think of. I did like journalism and academic writing and, you know, like theater writing and copywriting and fiction writing and nonfiction writing. And it was kind of just like anything that I could get from both a consumption and production standpoint. And then as my career has gone on, it's kind of gotten more focused. I worked in advertising as a copywriter for a while, and then I knew that I kind of wanted to widen out and work with people from different backgrounds. And then I found my way here, which it does, it's kind of a different type of breadth, but still now thinking a lot more about like the strategy of storytelling as well as the production, which is an interesting evolution.
Yeah. I kind of took a similar path to Anna. When I was a little kid, I was definitely interested in stories and making them up. And I had a friend who was very clear from a young age that she wanted to grow up and be a writer. And I remember thinking, well, I kind of want to do that too. And so I started writing a story, which I still have up in my parents' house. It's called Shark with an exclamation point. And it was this really goofy story about a shark that was terrorizing this town. It turned out okay in the end, so don't worry. Yeah.
So
it was a Hollywood producer who was making being the shark so that he could cast people for authentic screens.
Wow.
So I wrote this when I was like 7.
You knew about Hollywood producers when you were 7?
That's a little bit scary too. But I wrote a lot just for fun, in grade school and in high school and in college, enjoyed my literature classes and things like that. But it took me a long time to actually sort of bear the mantle of like, I'm a writer. Yeah. And I worked at a radio station doing sales, which I was terrible at. But the thing that I liked was that for my direct clients, meaning the clients that didn't have agencies, I got to write their spots. None of the other salespeople liked this process. And so I would take on their writing and eventually, extremely long story short, worked my way into working at a radio creative boutique, but I was doing account side work and then became an account planner, which is qualitative research, and then became a copywriter at an ad agency. And through that whole process started to be like, well, I am a writer. It was really hard for me to accept that though, to say I am a writer. That was a difficult journey. And then eventually coming to IDEO and then trying to figure out how to explain what I do, what we do, and break it down into terms that people can replicate. Because even some of it, honestly, is just, you kind of just do it. And I'm sure that all of you out there have figured out your own little workarounds and what works for you as well and where the process breaks down. So, it's been a long journey.
Yeah. And the thing is, it just takes like sitting down and doing it and doing a lot of crappy versions and like, even if nobody ever sees them, just kind of being like, okay, cool, there's always another one. Like you can just kind of keep renewing that page. And that's kind of part of the beauty of it. And it is hard to admit that you're a storyteller or a writer. And a lot of it is just in the act of doing it. And you're all doing that now, which is awesome.
Yeah. So we want to thank you all for being with us today. We've reached the end of our program. Should we call it a program?
Yes, it's a program. I would say yes. We talked about sharks and storytelling and producers and other things.
So this recording will be available within the class. So if you missed it or want to go back and review any of the things that we said, it's available for you online. We'll see you in class real soon and want to wish you the best of luck on your next, can I even speak right? No, on your next assignments.
Your final assignments.
Final assignment. Yeah. Wow.
Good luck, everyone.
Yeah, time flew. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.